At the age of 42, Yaya Touré was once the perfect embodiment of a rare, complete midfielder in the history of modern football. A person who could dominate the midfield with superior strength, technique, and intelligence. The person who played an important role in helping FC Barcelona achieve the historic treble in 2009, including the Champions League, La Liga, and Copa del Rey, where he even played in the center-back position in the final, proving his astonishing versatility. Afterward, at Manchester City, he became the soul in the team's transformation period, helping the club win the Premier League title in the 2011 to 2012 season with the decisive goal in the final rounds, and reaching his personal peak in the 2013 to 2014 season when he scored up to 20 goals in the world's toughest league, an extraordinary number for a central midfielder, while also winning another Premier League title along with many other domestic honors. On the international stage, he was the captain of the Ivory Coast national team, leading the Golden Generation to win the African Cup of Nations in 2015 after many years of bitter failures, and personally honored as African Player of the Year 4 consecutive years from 2011 to 2014, an achievement that affirmed his irreplaceable position in his peak period, where he was not only a great player but a symbol of strength, endurance, and the ability to decide matches that very few people in history could reach. But behind all those titles and glorious moments was a journey full of silences that not everyone saw, where a person had to learn to endure from very early on when growing up in poverty in Ivory Coast, where football was not a dream but the only path to escape harsh reality, and that very thing created a will not easily broken, but also made him a man of few words, always keeping every pain inside. The biggest event in his life came when his younger brother Ibrahim passed away while he was playing, a moment when he could not be there to say the final goodbye, and from then on, even though he continued to play and maintain a strong image on the field, some part inside him had changed, becoming quieter, more distant, as if football was no longer a place that brought joy but only a responsibility to fulfill. Then when his career gradually passed its peak, he did not leave in glory but in silence, when his role diminished, when those who once needed him no longer called his name, and it was precisely in those moments that his will lay not in returning to the peak but in continuing to exist, continuing to walk forward, even when the world ahead no longer had a place for him as before. If Yaya Touré's story makes you think about the price of greatness, please hit subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the untold journeys behind the halo. Before the name Yaya Touré became a symbol of midfield strength and was mentioned in bright Champions League nights, his life had begun in a place that almost had nothing to promise, in Bouaké, Ivory Coast, where poverty was not a temporary situation, but a reality stretching across generations, where children grew up not with the question, "Who do I want to become?" but how to survive through today. And it was precisely in that context that Yaya's childhood had no room for carefree finesse or soaring dreams, but only days following one another in deprivation, in the feeling of having to grow up much earlier than his age. A large family made everything always in a state of not enough, from food to living space, from learning opportunities to attention for each child. And in such an environment, responsibility was not given through words, but imposed by circumstances, forcing each member to find their own way to contribute, to understand by themselves that if they did not try, not only themselves but the whole family would be pulled back. Football entered his life not as a natural joy but as a rare escape, a fragile path, but the only path that could lead out of the cycle of poverty. And right from the first steps, he understood that this was not a game but an opportunity to live, an opportunity that if missed would never come a second time. His afternoons did not take place on flat pitches with green grass and standard goals, but on hard dry ground full of stones and gravel, where every slip left scratches on the skin, where the ball was often just a temporarily patched object. and where football boots became a luxury he did not always have. But it was precisely in those deprived conditions that he learned how to control the ball in every circumstance, learned how to keep balance when the ground was uneven, learned how to endure pain without stopping, because stopping meant falling behind. Nutrition not guaranteed forced his body to adapt in the harshest way, forcing it to become tougher, stronger in order to endure high movement intensity, and over time the limits others could not cross became the normal standard for him. Not because he was special from the beginning, but because he had no other choice but to become that way. There were no promises about the future. No one guaranteed that his efforts would be rewarded. Only the single truth that if he was not good enough, not strong enough, if he could not surpass everyone around him, then everything would end right there, in the very place he was born, and that awareness followed him in every run, in every touch of the ball, turning every training session into a challenge that was not allowed to fail. While other children could stop when tired, he did not have that right. While others could see football as a game, he had to see it as work, as responsibility, as the only path to change his fate, and that very pressure silently shaped a person not used to showing emotions, not used to complaining, but only knowing to keep moving forward, no matter how tired or painful. Each day passed in the repetition of deprivation and effort, he gradually understood that the world owed him nothing, that opportunities, if they came, only arrived for those strong enough to seize them, and that failure was not a gentle lesson, but a door slamming shut with no chance to open again. And precisely because of that, he never allowed himself to think about stopping, never allowed himself to imagine another path other than moving forward. Perhaps from the outside that journey was seen as the beginning of a dream, but for him it had never been a dream. It was a prolonged escape, an escape from poverty, from the limits of circumstances, from the fear that if he slowed down even one step everything would collapse. And in the silence of those years, with no audience, no prodigies, a person had been formed in the harshest way, not by glory but by pressure, not by choice but by necessity, and that very thing created the foundation for everything that would come later, a foundation built not from favorable conditions but from having to fight a life that had never promised anything. In a family where everything was always lacking and each person had to find their own way to survive, the relationship between Yaya Touré and his older brother Kolo Touré was not simply family ties, but also a silent but prolonged pressure over many years. Because Kolo was the one who went first, the one who reached professional football early and became the family's first hope. And when one person had already opened the path, those who came after were no longer allowed to fail. They not only carried their own dreams, but also the expectations of an entire family waiting for a change. For Yaya, that was not spoken out loud, but always present in the way people looked at him, in the invisible comparisons between the two brothers, in the silent questions about whether he could achieve something similar or even surpass his brother, and those very comparisons made him understand early that just being good enough was never enough, that if he wanted to survive and be recognized, he had to become different, had to be stronger, had to be tougher, had to do things others could not. But at the same time, the pressure came not only from proving himself, but also from the increasingly clear responsibility toward the family. When every earned penny, every opportunity gained carried the hope that it would make life back home better, and when a child grew up with the thought that his success could change the lives of many others, then failure was no longer a personal matter, but an unacceptable burden. In that situation, emotions gradually became a luxury, because to keep moving forward he had to learn to ignore weaknesses, had to suppress doubts himself, had to keep everything inside without being able to share, because sharing did not solve problems, and in a world where everyone was trying to survive, no one had enough time to carry another person's worries. Over time that formed a man of few words, not used to expressing emotions, not seeking sympathy, but instead a prolonged silence. A silence not because there was nothing to say, but because he did not know who to say it to or what to say it for, and that very silence became a protective shell, helping him endure increasingly heavy pressures, but at the same time making him more and more distant from those around him. Even in the family, where it should have been the safest place, the feeling of loneliness still existed in a way hard to name. Because each person had their own burden, each person was trying in their own way, and no one could really stop to understand everything the others were going through, making the moments together sometimes only physical presence, while inside each person was still isolated in their own world. And for Yaya, that isolation did not make him weaker, but on the contrary made him tougher, made him used to facing everything by himself, used to not relying on anyone, used to enduring without needing to be seen, and that very habit followed him throughout his later career, when he could stand among tens of thousands of spectators, play in the biggest matches in the world, but inside he was still a person who kept everything to himself, not revealing what was happening in his mind. Perhaps from the outside people saw a strong, calm player almost unaffected by pressure, but few realized that that calmness was not natural, but the result of many years learning not to feel too much, learning to control emotions so they would not pull him back. And when a person had gotten used to not allowing himself to be weak, they also gradually forgot how to seek comfort, making pains, when they appeared, have nowhere to go, no way to release, but only accumulate over time. And perhaps it was precisely in those years, when he was still a boy trying to become strong enough not to be left behind, that a part of him had changed forever, becoming a person who could endure a lot, could overcome a lot, but also a person who would carry that loneliness throughout his life, even when standing among his closest loved ones. The decision to leave Bouaké, to leave Ivory Coast when still very young, did not come as a romantic moment or a long-nurtured dream, but as a silent necessity, a step with no turning back in the journey that Yaya Touré had clearly understood beforehand, that if he did not dare to step out, he would forever be kept in the very place that had promised nothing. There was no complete farewell, no time to think too much. Because when the opportunity appeared, no matter how fragile, he had to seize it, and that very moment of leaving was not only a geographical change but a severance from everything familiar, from family, from language, from the sounds, smells, and rhythm of life he had grown up with, to step into a completely different world where he was no longer a natural part of the surrounding environment, but became a stranger, a person who had to start again from zero. When he set foot in Europe, what awaited him was not immediate opportunity, but a total shock. From the cold climate, unfamiliar streets, to a language he could not understand, could not express, could not communicate naturally. And in an environment where everything operated by different rules, the silence he had been used to before was no longer a choice but became a barrier, making it hard for him to connect, hard to find a foothold, and making him feel even more separated from everything around him. The first days had no stadium lights, no recognition, only training sessions where he had to prove himself to people who did not know who he was, did not care where he came from, and had no reason to trust him. And in that context, every mistake was exaggerated, every weakness was seen, making the pressure even heavier when he had no one beside him to share with or lean on. No more family, no more familiar faces, meals became quiet, evenings stretched in emptiness, and it was precisely in those silences that the feeling of loneliness was no longer a fleeting emotion, but became a constant state, a part of life he had to accept as the price to continue staying. The hardest thing was not adapting to the new environment, but realizing that he no longer completely belonged to the place he had left, but had also never truly belonged to the place he was standing, as if suspended between two worlds with no clear anchor, and every step forward meant moving further away from part of his old self. In football, he still continued to progress. still proved his ability through every training session, every small match, but outside the pitch life was still a chain of days having to face everything by himself. From simple problems like communication, eating, to bigger pressures like maintaining his position, keeping the opportunity he had traded so much to obtain. And in all of that, there was no room for weakness, because any sign of hesitation could make him replaced, eliminated, and pushed back to the place he had tried to leave. Each day passed in the repetition of effort and loneliness, he gradually understood that the decision to leave was not the beginning of an easier new life, but the start of a harder journey, where everything had to be rebuilt from the beginning, where nothing was guaranteed, and where every small success had to be paid for with many trade-offs. There were times when memories of home became clearer in silent moments, when he remembered familiar roads, familiar voices, things he once considered normal but now unreachable. And that very distance made him realize that leaving was not only to seek opportunity, but also to accept losing part of himself. And as the journey continued, as he gradually advanced further in his career, that gap did not narrow but grew larger, making the question of, where do I belong, harder to answer than ever, because he was no longer the boy in Buake, but had also never completely become part of the place he was living. That trade-off could not be measured by titles or money because it concerned deeper things, things that could not be seen, and it was precisely in that trade-off that a person continued to be formed. A person who understood that to survive and move forward, sometimes you had to accept losing things you could never get back, and had to keep walking even knowing that the road ahead would never bring the same sense of wholeness as what had been left behind. The days following one another in the repetition of effort and loneliness gradually turned into a harsh cycle, where Yaya Touré no longer measured time by weeks or months, but by training sessions, matches and times when his body was pushed to the limit, because in the European football environment talent was only a necessary condition, and to survive he had to become stronger, tougher, and harder to replace than anyone else. Training sessions were no longer simply about perfecting technique, but became tests of physical condition and will, where every run had to be faster, every challenge more decisive, and every time he fell, he had to stand up faster, because he understood that if he slowed down even one beat, someone else would be ready to take his place, and in a world with no room for patience, weakness was not allowed to exist. It was precisely in that environment that his body began to change in a way not everyone could endure. Muscles became tighter, strength increased day by day. The ability to withstand contact far exceeded normal standards, not because he wanted to become that way, but because he had no other choice but to adapt, but to turn his own body into his greatest advantage, to compensate for the things he did not have, like patronage, favoritism, or a guaranteed position. But that strength did not come for free. It was built from prolonged dull pains, from mornings waking up with a heavy body, but still having to step onto the field, from playing when not fully recovered, and from continually pushing his own limits beyond safety until the feeling of fatigue was no longer something to pay attention to, but became a normal part of life. He had no time to think about long-term health, because the distant future was not as important as keeping his position in the present, and in an environment where every match could decide a career, accepting risk with the body became inevitable, making every time he took the field not only an opportunity but also a trade-off. Gradually, he no longer saw his body as something that needed protection, but as a tool that needed to be used, a means to achieve goals, where pain was only a signal to overcome, not a reason to stop. And that very way of looking helped him become different, helped him play with an intensity many could not keep up with, but at the same time also made him distant from the feeling of listening to himself. Because in his world, listening to the body sometimes meant accepting weakness, and weakness was something unacceptable. The pressure to always be strong came not only from coaches or teammates, but from himself, from memories of days with nothing to rely on, from the fear of being left behind, and from the responsibility he still carried from family back home, making every time he took the field not just a match but an affirmation that he was still strong enough, still worthy enough to stay. In moments when others could allow themselves to slow down, he did not have that right, because he knew that there were people who did not have a second chance, and he did not want to become one of them, so he continued running, continued challenging, continued enduring, even when his body had begun sending warning signals. Over time, that endurance became part of his identity, making others see a player who almost never tired, a person who could maintain high intensity throughout the match, a person who always appeared in important moments. But few realized that behind that image was a process of accumulating unspoken pains, of limits continuously crossed, and of a person who had gotten used to putting goals above everything, even himself. And perhaps it was precisely in those years, when he turned his body into a non-stop fighting tool, that he unintentionally created a foundation for what would come later, a foundation of strength but also of wear, of endurance but also of accumulated damage. Because when a person got used to never stopping, they would also find it hard to recognize the moment when they needed to stop. And as the journey continued, the price of always being strong would gradually appear in a way no one could avoid. After the first fiery years with the thirst to prove himself, he stepped into a new chapter in his career that the whole world considered a dream, joining FC Barcelona, one of the greatest teams in football history, where every young player believed that just wearing the shirt once was enough to define an entire life. FC Barcelona. But for him, that dream from the beginning carried a strange feeling, as if he was standing in the middle of a lavish feast, but no one really invited him to sit at the table. The first days at Barcelona were a series of overwhelming days, where he was surrounded by world-class stars, people who already had solid positions in the tactical system, in the hearts of fans, and in the trust of the coaching staff. He watched them play football as if everything had been pre-programmed. Every pass, every movement fitting perfectly, while he, no matter how hard he tried, was still just a piece that had not found its right place. He played, he contributed, he left his mark in a few shining moments, but that was not enough to make him the center. He was always on the edge of attention, always mentioned as a potential talent, but never as an irreplaceable pillar. The feeling of having his role limited gradually became a silent obsession. He realized that in a team like Barcelona, talent did not always mean absolute trust. There were systems already shaped, there were names already engraved in history, and there were positions that no matter how hard he tried, he could not reach. Each match that passed, he felt he was trying to speak a language this collective no longer needed to hear. He could play well, even have matches where he shone, but after all the lights still turned to others. He was not the person built to become the heart of the team, but only a supplement, an alternative choice, a tactical option when needed. And that, more painful than any failure, was the lack of a feeling of belonging. In the locker room, he smiled, he talked, he integrated, but deep inside he all felt he stood outside an invisible circle that no one deliberately opened the door for him to step into. Training sessions at Barcelona were perfection to the point of coldness, where everything operated like a sophisticated machine, but that very perfection made him feel lost. He was not wrong, but also not special enough to break the existing order. Coaches came and went, tactics changed, but his position was never truly defined. He was not eliminated, but also not the final choice in important moments. That ambiguity stretched day after day, making him gradually understand that success did not always come with the feeling of complete recognition. There were matches where he scored, there were moments where he made a difference, but after all, the media still talked about others. People who scored more goals, people who were more iconic, people who fit the system better. He began to wonder whether he really belonged here or was simply existing in an environment not designed for him. Those evenings, returning to the quiet apartment in Barcelona, He often sat alone looking out at the city, where the bright lights reflected a life where he was standing on the edge. He had everything a young player could dream of: titles, big stages, recognition from outside, but lacked the most important thing: the feeling of absolute trust, of being placed at the center, of being seen as irreplaceable. Inside him began to form an internal struggle between continuing to stay and accepting the current role, or seeking another place where he could truly become himself. Each time he stepped onto the field, he tried to prove, not to the world but to himself, that he deserved more than what he was receiving. But football at the highest level was not always fair with personal emotions. It was a place of systems, of strategy, of cold choices. And in that system, he gradually understood that there were people born to be the center, and there were people only allowed to revolve around that center. He began to feel more clearly than ever the loneliness of success when you stood in a great team, lifted trophies, but inside did not feel you were a full part of that victory. Each title was a joy, but also a reminder that he was not the first person mentioned when history was rewritten. And it was precisely in that contradiction that the psychology of wanting to find a place to belong grew stronger inside him. Not loud, not explosive, but persistent like a crack that could not be repaired. He began to dream of another team, a place where every run of his carried central meaning, where his mistakes were forgiven faster, and his success was recognized more clearly. Barcelona had given him fame, had given him peak years, but could not give him the feeling of belonging. And that was the biggest paradox in his journey. Success had never meant wholeness. He stood between the halo and his own shadow, understanding that sometimes the hardest thing was not conquering the peak, but finding a place where you were truly called an indispensable part. The days at FC Barcelona no longer carried the color of a dream, but gradually turned into a series of psychological challenges where he had to fight not only with opponents on the field, but also with the feeling of being pushed out of the center of a machine that had operated too perfectly. FC Barcelona. Under Pep Guardiola, that team was not simply a collective, but a football philosophy elevated to the level of art, where every position was clearly defined. Every role had limits, and every player either blended into the system or was eliminated by the system. Pep Guardiola. At first, he still believed he could adapt, that talent and effort would help him hold his ground. But the deeper he went into that system, the more he realized that football at the level was not only about form, but about the absolute trust of the person holding tactical power. The relationship between him and Pep Guardiola was not a loud conflict, but a silent, prolonged tension with no clear explanation. There were tactical meetings where he felt he understood his own role, but did not feel certainty from the coach's eyes. There were matches where he played a solid role, even better than expected, but afterward was still substituted at moments he did not expect. There was no direct criticism, no public confrontation, only a series of decisions that made him gradually understand that he was no longer in the long-term plan. At first, he tried not to think too much. He told himself that this was Barcelona, where competition was fierce, where every position had many candidates. But over time, the feeling of being replaced was no longer random but became a clear trend. Other players began to be prioritized more, new faces given more opportunities, while he was gradually pushed toward a reserve role. No one said directly to him that he was no longer important, but everything around him was whispering that, in the clearest way. In training sessions, he still tried to show himself. He ran more, challenged more decisively, tried to make his mark in every play. But football at Barcelona did not only demand effort, it demanded absolute fit with the system. And when he began to realize he was no longer the priority choice, every effort seemed only an echo in a space that no longer listened to him. The most painful thing was not being left out of the starting lineup, but the feeling of being replaced in silence. There was no clear moment for him to say, "I have been eliminated." Only small steps, small decisions, matches passing, with his name appearing less in important moments. He began to understand that in top football existence, was not measured by talent alone, but by whether you were still in the strategic vision or not. There were afternoons after matches when he sat alone in the locker room after everyone had left, looking at the sweat-soaked jersey and wondering what had changed. He had not lost skill, had not lost desire, but seemed to have lost his place in the coach's tactical imagination. And that was more cruel than any injury, because it could not be seen, could not be diagnosed, and could not be cured by time. The relationship with Pep Guardiola became increasingly distant in a very strange way. There was no anger, no argument, only tactical distance and silence. He still respected him, still understood that the decisions were made for the benefit of the team, but inside him a question began to appear that was not easy to answer. If he was still needed, why was he gradually disappearing from the most important moments? Then one day, the conversation happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to change the entire direction of his career. He was told that the team was entering a new phase, that changes were necessary, that the future was being built in a different way. No one said he was not good enough, but the message was clearer than any direct rejection. He was no longer the center in that plan. He left the conversation with an indescribable feeling. Not anger, not completely sadness, but emptiness. He had once thought that, when you succeeded, you would have stability, that titles and contributions would protect your position. But the reality at Barcelona had taught him a different, crueler lesson. Success did not guarantee stability, and in top football, no one was irreplaceable. The decision to leave the team came sooner than he expected, and also came when he was not truly ready. Deep down, he still wanted to stay, still wanted to fight to regain his position. But football did not always allow emotions to lead the way. There were times when you were not pushed away because you failed, but because the system had moved to a phase that no longer had room for you. The day he packed his things, the training ground hallway became longer than usual. Each step was a memory. Each door passed was a part of the journey he had lived with all his heart. There was no grand farewell, no prolonged goodbye, only silence to the point that made everything heavier. He left Barcelona not in failure, but in the silence of a person who had once contributed to success, but was not allowed to become a long-term part of it. When the door closed behind him, he realized one thing more important than all the titles he had won. In football, being needed today did not mean being kept tomorrow. And sometimes the most painful thing was not being eliminated, but leaving when you still believed you could contribute more. After leaving FC Barcelona, many people thought that Yaya Touré's journey would slow down, that he would step into the final phase of his career as in safety and with less pressure. But reality opened a completely different chapter, where he not only found himself again, but also had to carry on his shoulders a city that was craving change, a club standing in the middle of a historic transformation process, and a collective that needed someone strong enough to turn ambition into reality. When he joined Manchester City, no longer a player who was doubted or replaced, but a central piece in the project to build new power in English football. At that time, Manchester City was no longer an average team looking for titles, but a symbol of modern ambition, where pressure did not come from shortage, but from the enormous expectations of money, of fans, and of the whole world watching their rise. And in that context, Yaya did not just come to play, but to shoulder a part of the weight that very few players could endure. Right from the first matches, he was no longer a player adapting, but became the center of every ball, the person connecting defense and attack, the person bringing the balance that this team had lacked for many years. And that made his role not only important tactically, but also symbolic, because he represented a new generation of players that Manchester City was building. Strong, direct, and unafraid of pressure. But along with that position came an increasingly heavy burden, because every match was not only an opportunity to prove himself, but also an affirmation that this project was going in the right direction. And in a team where every eye was focused on results, there was no room for prolonged mistakes. Yaya quickly became an irreplaceable pillar, not only because of his ability to control the midfield, but because his presence brought a sense of safety to the whole team. As if just having him on the field, the team always had a pillar to rely on in the most difficult moments, and that very thing made him no longer simply a player, but a part of the psychological structure of the entire team. In the 2011 to 2012 season, he scored iconic goals, especially in the final phase of the season, where every run of his carried the weight of an entire city waiting for a title after many decades. And when the Premier League title was won in the final seconds, he was not only a contributor, but one of the greatest symbols of that historic moment, a moment when Manchester City officially stepped into the ranks of England's great teams. But the closer he got to the peak, the heavier the pressure became, because success did not reduce expectations but only made them grow. And Yaya clearly understood that every season after that was no longer a journey of building but a journey of maintaining, holding firm, and proving that what had been achieved was not luck. In the locker room, he was not only a veteran player, but gradually became the one with an influential voice, the person young players turned to for learning, the person teammates relied on in tense moments, and that leadership role did not come from an official captaincy, but from his presence, from the way he played, from the way he reacted to pressure, from the stability he brought in the biggest matches. However, along with that respect was a responsibility that never decreased. Because when a team began to depend on one individual, that individual was no longer allowed to decline, no longer allowed to have off days, and every time he stepped onto the field, he had to maintain a standard that was almost impossible to maintain for long. The 2013 to 2014 season was his peak at Manchester City, where he not only controlled the midfield but also scored important goals, created differences in both attack and defense, became the model of a complete modern midfielder. But it was precisely in that season that the pressure also reached its highest level, when every expectation was placed on his shoulders and every mistake was exaggerated, because when you became the center of a winning system, you were no longer allowed to be just good. You had to always be the best. And while the outside world saw a player at the peak of his career, inside Yaya had to continuously face a question no one asked out loud: how to maintain a perfect version of himself in an environment that did not allow any decline, even the smallest. There were days he stepped onto the field with a tired body, but had no other choice but to continue. Because this city, this team, and this whole project were placing their faith in him as an irreplaceable pillar, and that very thing made him both honored and bound. He became the symbol of Manchester City's transformation, from an ambitious team to a real force in English football, but at the same time he also became the person carrying the entire weight of that transformation on his shoulders, where every victory was celebrated as a historic step forward and every defeat carried the feeling of a setback for the whole project. In all of that, Yaya Touré was not only a player but a pillar, a center, a person that an entire system relied on to operate. And that very thing made his journey at Manchester City both a brilliant peak and a burden that never truly disappeared, a burden named expectation, fame, and responsibility, weighing on the shoulders of a person who had gotten used to having to be stronger than everyone, even when no one asked whether he was okay or not. After becoming the irreplaceable center of Manchester City, Yaya Touré stepped into a season that many people later recalled as the moment he touched the absolute limit of a human being, not only physically but also in will, a season where he no longer played like a normal player but like an independent operating system on the pitch, where every rhythm, every transition, every important situation passed through his feet. And it was precisely in that period that the football world began to see him not only as an excellent midfielder, but as one of the most complete symbols of this position in the modern era. That season, he not only scored goals but scored decisive ones. Long-range shots became a strategic weapon, breaking every defensive structure of opponents, while still maintaining the ability to control the match rhythm with an almost cold calmness, as if he always saw a few seconds ahead what would happen next, and that made him the absolute center of the team in both attack and defense. Not many players in history could control the ball, carry the ball, finish and organize the play at the highest level at the same time. But Yaya in that season did it all as something obvious, as if his body was designed to shoulder every role on the field. And that very completeness made him recognized as one of the best midfielders in the world, a position that came not only from titles or statistics, but from the feeling that when he was on the field, the match always tilted toward his team. But behind that almost extraordinary stability was a non-stop playing intensity, where he had to appear continuously in important matches, from the Premier League to the Champions League, from decisive matches to matches demanding absolute concentration, and in all those matches he was not allowed to reduce speed, not allowed to make mistakes, because the whole system was relying on him as an irreplaceable point of balance. That pressure came not only from the coach or teammates, but from the very expectations he had created for himself. Because when a player reached such a peak, the standard was no longer measured by others, but by their own best version, and any decline was seen as an unacceptable step backward. Throughout that season, he almost played in a state of no complete rest, his body always under tension, always having to adapt to a dense schedule, to continuous trips, to matches where every minute on the field consumed a part of energy that could not be regained, but he still continued, because he understood that this was the moment when his entire career was defined, and missing it meant missing the chance to engrave his name in history. However, it was precisely in that seemingly perfect stability that the first signs of wear began to appear, not loudly, not clearly, but very small, like light pains after matches lasting longer than normal, like the feeling that his body no longer recovered as quickly as before, like short moments on the field where he realized he had to try harder to achieve the same effectiveness. His spirit also began to face pressure from continuous expectations, from always having to be the one creating the difference, from having no right to drop to normal level, because in his position normal meant each match that passed he had to balance between maintaining form and protecting his body. But in reality the choice always leaned toward dedication, because the team needed him, the city needed him, and he himself did not allow himself to stop. In the evenings after matches, when his body began to feel heavy, when fatigue no longer disappeared after just one sleep, he began to feel more clearly the price of always having to be at the peak. A price not recorded in any statistics, but accumulating day by day in silence. Those around him saw a player at the highest form of his career, a person who could decide matches at any time. But inside, he began to understand that nothing could be maintained forever at that level, that the body had limits, and so did the spirit, no matter how strong. And in the parallel between glory and wear that season became not only a peak of his career, but also of sacrifice, where he had given almost everything he could, not only to win, but to maintain the image of a person who never declined. But it was precisely in having to always be the best, always the one deciding, always the one not allowed to be wrong, that he gradually realized there was no peak that lasted forever, and that every brilliant moment carried within it a part of the price that would have to be paid later, a price that only when slowing down would people truly see clearly. After the season when Yaya Touré had touched the highest limit of his career, when every eye considered him the irreplaceable center of Manchester City, his life stepped into a chapter that no title could prepare for. A moment when football suddenly became small before real life, when the bad news about his younger brother Ibrahim Touré passing away hit like an unexpected cut, breaking the entire fragile balance he had painstakingly built over many years. It was not a sporting event, not a failure on the pitch, but a loss belonging to the deepest part of a person, where there was no tactic, no coach, no audience that could help him overcome it, only absolute emptiness when a blood relative disappeared from this world while he was very far away, in the middle of international duties, in the middle of matches where he was expected to continue playing, to continue representing his country with the Ivory Coast national team. And it was precisely in that moment that Yaya was placed in a choice no one should have to face, between returning to say goodbye to his youngest brother or continuing to stay, fulfilling his duty to the national shirt, a duty he had carried throughout his career, a duty he never allowed himself to abandon, even when his heart was breaking. The decision to stay was not coldness, but a painful sacrifice, a choice that only those in that situation could understand the real price of, when the body still had to move on the field, but the mind had left the match long ago, when every run no longer carried focus, but only the reflex of duty. And then when the news spread, the outside world did not always see the complexity of that moment. Instead, they were full of controversial reactions, criticisms aimed at his decision, that a professional player must prioritize the match, that he had chosen wrong, that he should have returned. But no one truly understood the gap between reason and pain, between responsibility and loss, between being an international player and being a big brother who had just lost the only relative who could share his entire journey with him. Those criticisms came not only from the media, but also from a portion of the public, who did not see that behind the stadium lights was a person trying to keep himself from collapsing. And that very thing made his pain more isolated when he not only lost a loved one, but also had to face judgment about how he dealt with that loss. In the days after that, he still continued to play, still stepped onto the field in the national team shirt. But everything had changed, not on the outside but on the inside, where the feeling of loss was no longer an event but became a prolonged state, a void that could not be filled by any victory. The following matches passed in internal silence, where he performed his duty like a person who had detached from his own emotions, where every pass, every challenge, every run carried a part of memory that could not be spoken, and even though he was still a world-class player on the field, in his eyes there was something that had changed forever. The pain did not disappear over time, but only settled into a different form of silence, a prolonged quietness that followed each season, making him speak less and less, withdraw more and more, and gradually turn personal emotions into something that only existed inside, never shared outside. Later, when looking back, many people only remembered the goals, the titles, the glorious moments, but few understood that there was a time when his career was no longer guided by ambition or achievement, but by a loss that could never be fully named. A wound that was not healed but only carried in silence. And it was precisely from that moment that a part of him had changed forever. Not in a way that made him weaker on the pitch, but in a way that made him more distant from the world around him, as if from then on every match was not only a sporting duty, but also a silent dialogue between past and present, between the living big brother and the brother who had gone, a dialogue that never had an answer, only the continuation of existence in wordless pain. After the spiritual wound from the family loss had not yet healed, football again pulled Yaya Touré into a new vortex, where his career was no longer defined by the peaks he had once reached, but by the change of the system around him at Manchester City, especially when Pep Guardiola returned to lead the team, bringing a completely different tactical philosophy, where every position, every role, every small detail had to fit absolutely with the structure he built, and in that system, not all those who had once been the center could keep their positions. Yaya, who had once been an irreplaceable pillar, gradually realized that his time on the field was no longer guaranteed as before, that every match was no longer a default about role, but became a wait to see whether he was still in the plan or not. And that very waiting created a new pressure, no longer coming from opponents, but from the silence in the coach's choices. At first, he still believed that experience, professionalism, and adaptability would help him continue playing an important role. But football at this level was not only a story of the past, but a continuous race of the present, where the tactical system could change the entire structure in just one season, and players who no longer fit would gradually be pushed out of the center without any explanation. Each week that passed, his playing minutes gradually decreased, not according to a clear script, but like a natural shift process, where he was not eliminated immediately, but also no longer placed in a priority position. And that very ambiguity made the feeling of being replaced harder to accept, because there was no moment clear enough to say, "This is the end." Only the quiet, gradual reduction of his role day by day. In training sessions, he still maintained a professional attitude, still made efforts, still kept the highest standards. But the atmosphere around had changed. When new players were given more opportunities, when tactical choices turned toward the future more than the past. And in that context, he began to feel clearly something he had never thought of before. That greatness in the past did not always guarantee a position in the present. The contradiction between the individual and the system became clearer than ever, because one side was a player who had once shouldered the whole team, once decided big matches, while the other side was a new tactical structure that did not depend on any individual, where everything was redistributed, re-optimized, and the individual, no matter how great, also had to accept his role in a new order. The hardest thing was not the reduction in playing time, but the feeling that his presence was no longer essential as before, that the team still operated, still won, still moved forward even when he was no longer at its center, and that feeling quietly created a gap between him and the collective he had once been an inseparable part of. In the moments sitting on the bench watching the match unfold without him, he began to understand that football never stood still, that it always moved forward, always sought new versions, new structures, new people, and that no position was permanent, even for those once seen as irreplaceable. When playing time continued to shrink, the feeling of no longer being needed did not come as a shock, but as a slow but certain process of realization, where he gradually had to face the truth that his role had changed, not because he had immediately become weaker, but because the system had evolved in a different direction. And in that process there was no grand explanation, no decisive dialogue, only the gradual change of reality, which made acceptance much harder than a clear ending. Yaya did not react with noise, did not turn it into public conflict, did not break his professionalism, but inside he had to face a truth that any player at the peak sooner or later had to face. That football did not keep anyone forever, and even those who had once stood at the center could be moved to the side when time and the system changed. When looking back at the entire journey at Manchester City, he realized that he had once been an indispensable part in the building process, once the person carrying the weight of the whole city on his shoulders. But it was precisely there that he learned that necessity was not permanent and that the wheel of football always continued, not waiting for anyone no matter how important they had once been. And that very awareness, even though not loud, was deep enough to mark a turning point in his psychology when, from a person always at the center of everything, he gradually learned to face becoming a person no longer in the main structure, but still had to continue existing in that very structure until the journey was forced to step into a new chapter. When his role at Manchester City gradually narrowed and Yaya Touré's presence on the field no longer carried the same centrality as before, his departure journey did not happen as people usually imagine about a football legend, with no grand farewell ceremony, no prolonged moment of tribute, no stadium packed with people chanting his name for the last time, but instead a quiet, almost invisible withdrawal, as if an important chapter in the club's history closed itself without needing noise. After all those years of attachment, the titles, the matches that decided history, the end of his time there was not marked by a formal ritual but by silence. And that very silence made the feeling of leaving emptier than any failure on the pitch. After leaving England, he stepped into the final years of his career at Olympiacos and some other clubs, where football was no longer the peak competition as before, but became a journey that slowed down, where his body no longer reacted like in the most brilliant years, and speed was no longer the absolute weapon that helped him dominate. In the new environments, he was no longer the center of the system, but became an experienced player. A big name from the past, expected more for spiritual value than for the ability to change matches, and that very shift marked an unavoidable truth. Time did not stand on anyone's side, even those who had once dominated at the peak. His form in this period could no longer maintain the stability as before, not because he had completely lost skill, but because his body no longer responded to continuous high intensity like in the peak years. And every time he took the field became a check between memory and reality, between what he had once been able to do and what he could do now. Matches became fewer, his role on the field narrowed, and opportunities to create direct influence also became rarer, making the feeling of being pushed to the edge return once again. But this time it was no longer a tactical change in a big team, but the natural sign of a career heading toward its end. What made this period particularly heavy was not the number of minutes played or goals scored, but the change in the way the world looked at him. When the media no longer mentioned him as a tactical center, but as a name belonging to the past, a legend gradually entering the memory of modern football. Articles, analyses, sports programs began to shift focus to the new generation, and his presence gradually became more of a faint shadow than a highlight, as if he was existing in a space where time no longer prioritized him. At the final clubs, he still played with the familiar professionalism, still kept a serious attitude in every training session, still passed on experience to the young players around him, but the biggest difference was that he was no longer placed in a position where everything revolved around him, and that created a different kind of loneliness, not loud, not dramatic, but prolonged and quiet, where a person who had once shouldered the whole team now only stood on the edge of the main flow. Meanwhile, the silence from fans also became clearer, not because they had completely forgotten him, but because football always moved continuously, always created new stories to replace old ones, and even the greatest moments were gradually pushed back over time. There was no outrage, no controversy, only the natural silence of a world that had moved to another chapter. The feeling of his departure, therefore, did not resemble a recorded ending, but like a gradual disappearance from the center of collective memory, where what had once made his name still remained, but was no longer mentioned frequently, no longer placed in the present, but only appeared in short nostalgic segments when people talked about the past. And in that quietness, the hardest thing was not leaving a team or a league, but realizing that even a career that had once been brilliant enough to change the history of a club could pass without needing a worthy farewell, without a moment to stop so the world could look back and fully acknowledge everything that had been traded. For Yaya Touré, that journey did not end with a bang, but with stillness, where he stepped out of the main stage, not in failure, but in the silence of a person who had once been at the center of everything, but in the end left in a way that very few people truly noticed the moment he disappeared. After leaving the biggest stages of European football, Yaya Touré's life was no longer defined by the cheers of tens of thousands of spectators or the bright lights of peak matches at Manchester City, but began to shift to a slower, quieter, and also heavier rhythm in a very hard-to-name way. There was no longer a dense match schedule, no longer transcontinental flights, no longer pressure to prove himself against the strongest opponents in the world, but in return there was a new emptiness, where silence was no longer covered by the noise of football, but became clear to the point that it was sometimes almost heavy. In the post-retirement period, he began to step into coaching and youth player development, a role that no longer placed him at the center of the pitch, but brought a different kind of meaning, where he could pass on experience. lessons traded with an entire career, to the next generation, and that very thing made him see football from a different angle, no longer just about winning or titles, but about the process of forming people. When standing on the sideline in the coaching role, he was no longer the person deciding every play, but the observer, the guide, the person helping young players understand that behind every match was a long journey of discipline, sacrifice, and choices. But even though he took on the new role, his life no longer had the glamour as before, and the days without playing forced him to face a reality that many professional athletes often encountered. When the stadium lights went out, the question of "who am I" became clearer than ever. He was no longer defined by goals or titles, but by the way he lived each day, the way he looked back at the past, and the way he sought new meaning for the part of life after his career. Time for family and personal life became more, and in those moments he began to feel more clearly the value of things that had once been left behind during the peak playing years. With no more intense training sessions or decisive matches, he could sit quietly, could observe life happening more slowly, and could be more present in the small things that before had often been overshadowed by professional pressure. However, even though life outside became calmer, inside him there was still a flow of memories where the years playing at FC Barcelona and Manchester City still appeared like important chapters that could not be erased. Sometimes in the silences he remembered matches where he had once been the center. Moments when the entire stadium seemed to revolve around every run of his, and the contrast between the brilliant past and the quiet present made him unable to avoid thoughts about the passing of time. In the coaching role, he began to understand more clearly that success was not only about standing at the peak, but also the ability to maintain balance after leaving it. The young players he worked with not only needed technique or physical condition, but also guidance on how to face pressure, failure, and themselves. And it was precisely in that process that he gradually realized that what he had been through was not only a personal story, but also a form of lesson that could be passed on. Thoughts about the past no longer carried the color of pure regret, but became a process of looking back with greater calmness, where he could accept both success and the losses that had passed in his career. He understood that not every great moment needed to last forever, and that not every ending meant failure, because there were endings that were simply a transition to a different form of existence. Gradually, his view of success and failure also changed. If before success was measured by titles, number of wins or recognition from the outside world, now he began to see it through a different lens, where the value of a career lay not only in what was achieved, but also in what had been overcome. The difficulties, the pressures, the losses, all became an inseparable part of the journey, and it was precisely them that defined the deepest meaning of a person. In the stillness of post-retirement life, he no longer raced against time as before, but began to understand it more clearly. Time was no longer an opponent on the pitch, but something that had silently shaped his entire life, from the early days in Ivory Coast to the peaks in Europe and the quiet years after all the lights had gone out. And in that change, one thing became clearer than ever. Yaya Touré's life did not end when he left the pitch, but only shifted to a different form, where the quietness was not disappearance, but the way a person continued to exist after having gone through all the peaks and the immeasurable losses. Yaya Touré's life began from the dusty dirt roads in Ivory Coast, where football was not a luxurious dream but the only path to escape poverty, and from that seemingly unpromising starting point he stepped out into the world with a journey that was later recalled as one of the greatest midfielder careers in modern football. From harsh local pitches he rose to Europe, from nameless days to wearing the FC Barcelona shirt, where he contributed to the club's greatest titles in history, then becoming an irreplaceable pillar at Manchester City, where he not only helped the team change its status in English football, but also became a symbol of a historic transformation period for the entire club. That journey, seen from the outside, was an almost perfect chain of success, but when looked at more deeply, it always went hand in hand with losses that no title could compensate. Throughout his career, he reached peaks that very few players could touch, from European club championships, domestic titles in England, to the captaincy of the Ivory Coast national team, where he led the golden generation of his country's football. But parallel to that were personal voids that could not be filled. From losing his brother Ibrahim during the peak of his career to the years of having to endure continuous pressure between national duty and personal life, where every decision carried a very great emotional price. He was not a person defined only by victories, but a person who always had to live in the fragile balance between success and losses that could not be put into words. What made his journey special was not only the number of titles or important goals, but the way he overcame each difficult period without losing the resilience he possessed. From a poor boy with nothing in his hands, he built a career that many dreamed of. But that path had never been easy, because every step forward came with sacrifice, every peak carried a part of trade-off, and every glorious moment had a shadow accompanying it behind. When his playing career closed and he stepped into a new role in coaching, he began to look back at his entire journey with a different perspective. No longer the insider fighting every match, but a person who had gone through it all, and in the stillness of life after football, he realized that not everything in life could be kept. Not every great moment lasted forever, and not every sacrifice was rewarded as fully as people usually imagined. He was not a perfect person, and that very thing made his story more real, because in the brilliant successes there were always mistakes, voids, and unavoidable pains. But what made his value was not perfection, but the ability to keep moving forward, even when life continuously presented challenges that seemed impossible to overcome, from poverty, loss, playing pressure, to the non-stop change of top football. Looking back at the entire journey, from the early days in Africa to the peaks in Europe, from the bright lights of the world's biggest stadiums to the stillness of life after retirement, what remained was not only the trophies or the statistics, but the image of a person who had gone through many layers of glory and suffering and still continued to stand firm, not because he had never fallen, but because he always found a way to stand up after each time. The legacy that Yaya Touré left was not only in the history of Manchester City or FC Barcelona, but also in the story of a person who started from poverty, overcame every limit of circumstances, carried the hope of family, country, and himself, to then become proof that success was never separate from loss and greatness never came without a price to pay. And when all the lights had gone out, when the cheers had receded into the past, what remained was not the image of a perfect player, but the image of a resilient person who never stopped moving forward through every phase of life, carrying both glory and pain, and turning it all into a story that went beyond football, a story about willpower, sacrifice, and the ability to continue living even when there was nothing left to prove. Looking back at Yaya Touré's journey, from the dusty dirt roads in Ivory Coast to the bright lights of FC Barcelona and then the pillar role at Manchester City, people cannot see only a pure football career, but a journey of a person who always had to pay the price for every step forward. He reached the peak of fame, won titles, became a symbol of a generation of complete midfielders. But behind those titles was profound loss, especially the death of his brother Ibrahim when he could not return in time, and the periods of being replaced, being pushed out of the center, even when still at high form. The saddest thing was not that he failed, but that even when successful he still could not keep all the important things in his life. His career showed a harsh reality. In the world of football, and more broadly in life, there is no success that comes with absolute wholeness. The greater he became, the heavier the burden, and the clearer the loneliness, especially when his role was reduced under Pep Guardiola, when he had to leave the team in silence, and when the media gradually forgot a legend who had once dominated the midfield. From that story, American audiences can draw a very practical lesson. Success is never the final destination, but a journey that always comes with trade-offs. In modern society, where people are often swept into the pressure to achieve fame, money, and position, Yaya Touré's story reminds us that those values cannot replace family, mental health, and the feeling of belonging. He was not only a great player, but also a person who had learned to exist in loss, silence, and change. And that very resilience was the deepest legacy he left for the world. If you feel the journey full of loss, resilience, and willpower of Yaya Touré, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next profound stories about sports legends. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the destinies behind the halo of the pitch.